Good morning, Al.
Hello, Jay. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much. And is it Al or Alvin? I want to make sure.
Al's fine.
Okay.
Al's fine.
I will tell just to full disclosure, McGraw Millhaven, who is the host of the show, got a copy of the book and hasn't given it back. It must be that good. So I did not get a chance to read the book, but I'm going to demand that McGraw bring it in, or I'll buy my own copy. But the topic.
Well, we'd like you to buy your own.
That's what I figured, so I'll go out and do that. But the topic, I consider myself to be a moderate conservative, but one who's followed the conservative movement over the years. And William F. Buckley is certainly a person who was at the heart of that movement from its very beginning. What drew you to Mr. Buckley and this book?
Well, many things. First of all, he had an extraordinary life. George Will used to say that Buckley had the kind of smile that could light up an auditorium.
Yep.
He used his many personal traits extraordinarily well to promote a movement and a cause and win converts. When Buckley passed, it was in February of 2008. I asked my students how many people had heard of him, and all the hands went up. So I was rather gratified. I asked what they knew about him, and the answer was very little. Well, why did you raise your hands? Said I. Well, because they subscribed to all these internet alerts, and they kept getting blasted from whatever they got, whether it was Time or Rolling Stone or the Washington Post or even the Daily Pennsylvanian, that he had passed.
Right.
And that's the kind of attention that only rock stars and ex-presidents get. They knew very, very little about him. But at the same time, they grew up in a world where you turn on the set, and there are these panels, and there's always a conservative, sometimes more than one conservative on the panels. And they knew nothing about a time where he was the only one, he was all alone for decades, that whenever they wanted to match wits with one of the leading intellectual lights of the day, it was always Buckley. Now, in your field and in mine, we all know people that are set to punch above their weight. This is a fellow who was sent out to debate the best of his generation on the other side. The playwright Norman Mailer, a novelist Norman Mailer, the playwright Gore Vidal, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, the historian Arthur Schlesinger. I can go on and on and on. He was the only syndicated columnist on the right for some time. 500 newspapers carried him. When we had 500 daily newspapers.
That's right.
He wrote novels. He wrote nonfiction. He edited a magazine and appeared at 70 colleges a year. This is a man that performed across multiple platforms at a time without social media.
Right.
And I thought that is a great case to make on how one can carry forward a message. And of course, those of us interested in modern conservatism, he was indeed the founder of it.
He was the founder and the face for so long. Talk a little bit about how he got started with the conservative movement and how he then became the face and the kind of carried the laboring oar for the longest time.
Well, he invented it to some degree, and then he changed it as it went along. When he was a young man, Calvin Coolidge was born. Calvin Coolidge was in the White House. Think of those days.
Right.
A very weak federal government, an isolationist foreign policy. When you talk about government, you talk about Borough Hall. You didn't talk about Washington. The New Deal was yet to come. And, of course, during his youth, all these things began to change. He first began to adhere to his parents' politics, of course, which were all the things we said, but also he was a member of an active teenager in what was called the America First movement, late 1930s, which was led by Charles Lindbergh in an effort to prevent the United States from arming Britain in its hour of need. The great fear was the closer the United States got, at least the great fear of the isolationists, to helping one of the belligerents, the greater chance of war would come. Well, he put those politics aside long after the war and became a very active interventionist and cold warrior, as we know. But as he looked around, there wasn't much of a movement. There were people who called themselves conservatives but coalesced on certain things. For instance, Robert Taft, Buckley's hero, Senator from Ohio, isolationists, anti-labor unions to a large extent, limited government to a large extent. Well, when it came to those things, he had allies of conservative Democrats who represented the South. These were right-to-work states. These were states that didn't like federal intervention because of the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. But when it came to other things, they had nothing in common. Robert Taft was a great advocate of civil rights, and most of those Southern Democrats were not. So there was not much of a coalescing you could talk about. He decided, he borrowed the term fusionist from one of his friends, Mr. Meyer, who was a great libertarian, Frank Meyer of the time. And the idea was that in the presence of a common enemy, in this era, we're talking about Stalinist tyranny, that some of those strains may have a common cause to pull together. So he brought in some of the states' writers who I mentioned, libertarians who didn't like much government at any level, didn't want to be bothered, leave us alone crowd, as Grover Norquist likes to call them. Traditionalist conservatives, these are people who believe in institutional prerogatives and separation of powers. We tend to think of Edmund Burke as their hero. And real politics types that really felt we needed to contain the Soviet Union and push back court. That became the movement. He founded National Review magazine in 1955 to bring them all together, where they could read each other's writings and readers should find some of their ideas affirmed and explained. And that was the beginning of the movement. He then pushed towards perhaps if the conservatives would take over one of the two political parties, the other party, in this case the Democrats, might become the liberal party, and voters would be given a choice. When Buckley came of age, you may have heard the phrase of George Wallace and others about not a dime's difference between the two parties.
Right.
You had two broad tents. You had conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and it wasn't quite clear that this was a responsive form of government. At least it wasn't clear to Buckley, and it wasn't clear to intellectuals on the liberal side like James McGregor Burns, who always argued it made no sense to have the Kennedy brothers and Senator Eastland and Senator Stennis and other segregationists in the same party. Right. So there was pressure in the Eisenhower period, which we tend to think of as a quiet period, a period of great liberal consensus. There was a pulling apart underneath, and we began to see that with the Goldwater campaign.
Right, and that's, Buckley had tremendous influence, not only on the conservative movement, but on the presidents that kind of followed the beginning of this. It started with the campaign of Barry Goldwater, but it went into the Reagan years and the Bush years. And talk a little bit about his influence on the presidents, the past presidents during that time.
Yeah. Well, I'll begin by saying very briefly that even presidents that didn't like his philosophy or didn't like him were certainly aware of it. John F. Kennedy made reference to Buckley, who was barely 30 years old in 1962. He was barely over 30. And at a speech at Yale, Kennedy listed a number of critics, Yale alumni, all who were harming his administration in some ways. And he mentioned Henry Ford, the car manufacturer, of course. He mentioned Henry Luce, the editor of Time. And he mentioned this young graduate of Yale University, William F. Buckley, who had a column for only 4 months at that point, and yet he got on the president's radar screen. Amazing.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah. Ronald Reagan, well, first of all, Buckley took a view toward Richard Nixon in 1968 that Maggie Thatcher said about Gorbachev. Here's the man I can do business with.
Right.
He may not be one of us, but we might be able to come to terms. But with and Buckley became a major influence in Nixon's nomination at that point over Rockefeller, who he thought was too liberal, Nelson Rockefeller of New York, the governor, and a newcomer to politics named Ronald Reagan. Buckley loved Reagan, but he said he's only governor a year. He may not be taken seriously. An actor turned politician, only 1 year of service. That was at a time where freshman senators didn't feel that they had to run for president, and people without any government experience got elected president.
They used to think you would earn the right to run for president.
Yes, and he felt, well, we could hold Ronnie for another time. Well, that time came, beginning in 1976, eventually 1980. I know your time is short, but let me just say that Ronald Reagan said that William Buckley did more than any other person to prepare America for the Reagan presidency and to make the Reagan presidency possible. Buckley was Reagan's guide and Lone Star as he was making that long journey from liberal Democrat to conservative Republican. Reagan was funny about this. Even though he was an actor, he was aware of Buckley long before Buckley was aware of Reagan. Buckley didn't follow much of the popular culture in those days, and I certainly doubt he saw a lot of the B movies
films.
that Reagan started. But Reagan read National Review from the first issue. He was a charter subscriber. He was a spokesman for General Electric after his motion picture career ended. And he took National Review on the train with him as he crisscrossed the country, talked to audiences. He loved the wit, he loved the writing, and above all, he loved the politics. He found free market politics in it. Adam Smith, a dead economist, shall we say, and then a very lively young economist at the time, Milton Friedman, who believed in incentive-based public policies to pull people up to their own efforts. Right. Without government intervention.
Yeah, we have just about a minute. I'm sorry, Mr. Felsen.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We have
when Reagan was elected, Buckley becomes not just an intellectual source, but also a great political consultant and advisor.
Alvin Felsenberg, his new book, A Man and His Presidents, The Political Odyssey of William F. Buckley. In the last minute we have, I know this isn't much time to talk about it, but what do you think Mr. Buckley would have thought about today's version of the conservative movement and Donald Trump's populism?
Well, part of Buckley was populism, too. He railed against the liberal establishment, but he also believed very deeply in separation of powers and the strength of Congress as a separate independent branch. He'd be the first one to say that committee chairmen, individual members, Speaker of the House, and others are not presidential aides. They represent a separate branch as the framers intended. Power was divided. And they should pass programs and send them to the president. They should negotiate with the president. But we're not only a presidential nation. Remember the Marx Brothers movie, Duck Soup, where Groucho calls him the secretary and he says, take a law. Well, that wasn't William F. Buckley. That was not William F. Buckley. He would tell the president a little less every day in weighing in on certain things, and a little more planning, a little more policy, a little less persona. He was somewhat guarded about politicians he thought were building either a cult of personality or had a tendency toward narcissism. I'm quoting Buckley now. I'm not talking about Trump.
Right.
But I think he would, above all, say, well, where's Congress in all of this? He was very outspoken, not only through Vietnam, but all the way through it, that, yes, it's one thing to blame presidents. It's another thing to say, well, why isn't Congress holding them accountable? And I know he said that under George Bush, he said that under both George Bushes.
Absolutely.
And he'd probably say it now, too, whoever the president was.
Right. Mr. Felsenberg, thank you so much for joining us. His book, A Man and His Presidents, The Political Odyssey of William F. Buckley Jr., I am going to not wait for McGraw-Milhaven to return his copy. I'm going to buy my own and read it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. My publisher thanks you, and I thank you.
Very good. It is 9:25. KTRS, the Big Five.